Konnichiwa. In this video, we're going to be learning about Japanese verbs and the categories that they come in. So first, before we start out, we should probably know what exactly is a verb, right? So this is a kind of a basic question, but basically, a verb is a word that conveys an action, an occurrence, or a state of being. So let's look at some examples in English. So for instance, he reads a book. Reads here is the action, so that's the verb. She becomes a doctor. That becomes is an occurrence, so that's the verb. It stands in the corner. That's a state of being, so that is the verb there. So those are the kind of words that we're talking about. So in Japanese, just like in English, in many languages, you might be familiar with verbs conjugate. So in other words, they change forms to express a variety of different grammatical information. So to take the example of a language, you might be familiar with Spanish, right? So Spanish verbs conjugate for tense. So is it present, past, future? Mood, indicative, subjunctive. Person, is it me? Is it you? Is it someone else? And number, is it one person? Is it multiple people, right? Depending on all these factors, we get different forms of the verb. So for instance, this is the present indicative endings for AR verbs in Spanish, right? And we have these 6 different forms that you have to memorize just for that one conjugation. Japanese is often thought of as a hard language, but when it comes to conjugation, it's actually much simpler than many languages you may know, in particular many European languages, right? So in Japanese, verbs also conjugate, but they conjugate for tense, politeness, and polarity. In other words, is it affirmative or negative? Do you do it or do you not do it? And that's really it. So we don't have to worry about things like first, second, third person, or singular or plural. That doesn't come into it in Japanese. These are the non-past polite endings for all verbs in Japanese. We just have one for affirmative, one for negative. That's it. So in some ways, learning Japanese is a lot easier than learning some other languages, right? So to get these are the polite conjugations. To get these conjugations, we have to start with the base form of the verb. And this form is what we show on the vocabulary lists in the textbook, and it's called the dictionary form because it's also the form that you would find in a dictionary if you were to look up the word. So it's kind of the base form that you can make all the other forms from. So for instance, we have all these verbs from this lesson. Now, these verbs are divided into 3 different categories, and depending on the category, the conjugation rules are slightly different, right? The endings are all actually the same, but we need to get different stems for the verbs. So we have to know which category the verb falls into to be able to conjugate it. So the categories are irregular verbs, u-verbs, and ru-verbs, right? So irregular verbs in this lesson, we have suru and kuru. U-verbs, iku, kiku, kaeru, nomu, kau, and yomu. And then ru verbs, okiru, taberu, neru, miru, right? So you might notice, so why are these called u verbs? Why are these called ru verbs? Well, you'll notice that all the ru verbs end in ru. You'll notice all the u verbs end in some sort of u sound. So they're named after the endings of the dictionary form, the sound endings of the dictionary form. So if only it were exactly that simple, it's nearly that simple, but I'm going to explain a little bit more about how to determine the category of a verb based on just looking at the dictionary form. So first we'll start with irregular verbs, and it turns out there are only 2 irregular verbs in the whole language, and we're learning them in this lesson. So after this, there won't be any more irregular verbs. Everything will be regular. So the 2 verbs are suru, which means to do, but it's also used where we would use play in some cases in English. So we say play sports, play basketball, and in Japanese it's do sports, do basketball. Or games, play a game, you also do a game in Japanese. So this is, but it's just the alter-purpose verb for to do, suru. And then kuru, which means to come. Those are the only 2. Now, there are some other verbs we also study in this lesson, benkyou suru, which is what's known as a suru verb because it has a word benkyou that's just compounded with suru. These conjugate irregularly, but just like suru. So you can just think of them as being kind of an extension of this verb to do. So this is to study, literally, benkyou is study, so to do studies, right? And we'll talk more about these kind of suru verbs. We'll talk about them in a little more detail in a different video. But basically just suru and any verbs derived from it, and kuru are the two irregular verbs. Now, verbs, do verbs, how do we tell them apart? So there are some hard and fast rules that are 100% accurate. If it ends in something that is not do, if the dictionary form ends in something that is not do, it's an verb, right? So we know it's not a do verb because it doesn't end in do. So for instance, iku, to go, kiku, to listen, nomu, to drink, kau, to buy, yomu, to read. None of these ends in do, so we know that they're verbs. So that's a really simple rule, right? Now, if it ends in do, it can be either an verb or a do verb, right? But one more hard and fast rule. We look at the sound before do. If it's an a, o, or u sound, so in other words, if the verb ends in aru, oru, uru, it will always be an verb, right? We don't actually have any examples of this in this lesson, but here's some examples from lessons that are coming up later. So toru, which is to take, as in a picture. This ends in an oru sound, so we know that it's an verb. Suaru, this is to sit down. This ends in an aru sound, so we know it's an verb. Tsukuru, this is to make something. This ends in an uru sound, so we know it's an verb. So that's also 100% accurate. Aru, oru, uru will always be an verb, right? So then we also have verbs that end in iru or eru sounds, right? And in this case, almost all of these are do verbs. So that's what you're going to be looking for to figure out if it's a do verb. Does it end in iru or eru, right? So for instance, miru ends in an iru sound, to look at, to watch. This is a do verb. Okiru ends in an iru sound, to wake up, do verb. Neru ends in eru, this is to go to sleep, a do verb. Taberu, to eat, ends in eru, it's a do verb. So this is almost 100% accurate, but there are some exceptions. So for instance, kaeru, this is to return home, to go home. It ends in an eru sound, but it's an verb. So there are some small exceptions to this rule. Almost always, iru, eru will be a do verb, but you need to memorize the exceptions. And they really are a small enough number that you can memorize them. We'll learn a few over the course of the textbook. So just as they come along, remember, okay, it ends in iru or eru, but it's an exception, it's an verb, right? So it's a little bit complicated, like which vowels come before do to make it an verb, which ones make it an do verb. If you're having trouble memorizing that, it might be helpful to just memorize two representative do verbs. So for instance, miru and taberu are really, really common do verbs. So if you just memorize that miru and taberu are do verbs, you can think, okay, so in miru, it's an I sound before do. In taberu, it's an e sound before do. Okay, I can remember which vowel comes before to make it a do verb, right? So just to kind of summarize, if we have a decision tree, if you're looking at a verb, first you ask yourself, is it suru or kuru? If it is, then we know it's an irregular verb. If it's not, we ask ourselves another question. So really the question you need to ask then is the last sound iru or eru, right? If it is, then it's a do verb with a few exceptions, right? And if it's not, then we know for sure that it's an verb. So really with just these two questions, you can pretty much get what category of verb it is, except for the few exceptions that come in the iru, eru verbs, some of which, those very small exceptions, are verbs. Okay, so now we know what verbs are, we know how to categorize them in Japanese, so that's all for this video. So until next time, じゃあまた。